Welcome to the deep dive. When we think about fairy tales, those classic stories we all grew up with, there's this sense of enchantment, right? A kind of timeless magic.
Oh, absolutely. Those happily ever afters, the sense that good always triumphs. It's comforting in a way.
Yeah, but what if I told you there's a whole other side to these stories? A kind of hidden history where those perfect endings weren't always so guaranteed. For you, and I know you love a good story, I think this is going to be fascinating.
It really is. The fairy tales we know today, they've gone through some pretty dramatic transformations over the centuries. And I think what's really interesting is that this isn't just about nostalgia. It's about understanding how these stories have been shaped and sometimes reshaped by forces we might not even realize.
Right, and I think that's what we're going to do in this deep dive, uncover those forces and really trace that journey
Hmm.
from the very beginnings of fairy tales to, well, those big budget movie adaptations we see today.
Exactly. From those shadowy origins to, the economic forces shaping them now, it's quite a journey.
Okay, so let's start at the very beginning. Where did these seemingly timeless tales actually come from? Because I have a feeling it wasn't all sparkling castles and fairy godmothers from day one.
You're exactly right. The origins of fairy tales are anything but glamorous. They were part of oral tradition, passed down through generations by word of mouth.
So before they were written down, they were just told and retold around campfires.
Exactly. Imagine a time before widespread literacy, where stories were the primary form of entertainment, education, and even a way to pass down warnings and moral lessons.
Oh, that's right. Figures like the Grimm brothers and Charles Perrault, they're the ones who started collecting and writing down these stories.
They were, and their work was incredibly important in preserving these tales. But their versions, even back then, weren't exactly the sanitized versions we often see today. They were often pretty dark and, well, grim.
Not exactly bedtime stories then.
No, not really. In their original form, these tales often served as cautionary tales, reflecting the very real dangers of the time. They were about teaching people, especially young people, how to navigate a world that could be quite harsh.
Wow, so it's like instead of a sweet story about a princess finding her prince, it would be more like a warning about the dangers of the forest or trusting strangers.
Precisely. It was about survival. These stories served as a way to teach lessons about the importance of obedience, the dangers of greed and vanity, and the consequences of making foolish choices.
That makes sense. But how do we get from those dark and gritty tales to the more, I don't know, whimsical and romantic versions we often encounter today?
Well, like most things, fairy tales evolved over time. As societies changed, so did the way these stories were told and understood. For example, the rise of Romanticism in the 19th century, with its emphasis on emotion and imagination, had a huge impact on how these stories were reinterpreted.
So it's like cultural shifts started to filter down into these stories.
Exactly. And then there's the Victorian era, which brought about a focus on morality and sentimentality. This further led to a softening of the harsher elements found in earlier versions.
It's interesting to think how these stories, which started out as almost like survival guides, became something more entertaining.
Right, and that's a key part of the transformation. What began as localized warnings, deeply rooted in specific communities and their fears, gradually transformed into broader, more universal narratives.
And I imagine the shift from agrarian societies to more industrialized ones also played a role.
Absolutely. As people moved from rural communities to urban centers, the anxieties and concerns they faced also changed. Fairy tales adapted to reflect these new fears and taboos.
You mentioned earlier the role of publishers, and I'm curious, how do they contribute to this evolution?
Oh, publishers have played a huge role in shaping how these stories are presented to the world. They essentially act as gatekeepers, deciding what gets published and distributed.
So they have a lot of power in determining what we as readers end up seeing.
They do. And as you can imagine, commercial considerations often play a significant role in their decisions. This can sometimes lead to a sanitization of the original tales.
Can you give us some specific examples of that? What kind of content might have been removed or toned down over time?
Sure, think about Snow White. In some earlier versions, the queen's jealousy and cruelty were depicted in pretty graphic detail, and her punishment at the end was much harsher. Those aspects are often toned down significantly in the versions we see today.
Yeah. And what about Cinderella? I feel like her story has also gone through a lot of changes.
Oh, absolutely. In some of the original Cinderella stories, the stepsisters went to some pretty extreme lengths to try and fit into the glass slipper, even resorting to self-mutilation.
Wow, that's definitely not something you'd find in a typical children's book today.
Right, and that's the point. The motivation behind the sanitization is often multi-layered. It's about making the stories more palatable for younger audiences, but it's also about appealing to a wider market and respecting changing cultural sensitivities.
And of course, we can't talk about sanitized fairy tales without mentioning Disney. I mean, they've built an empire on reimagining these classic stories in a more family-friendly way.
They have, and their influence is undeniable. But it does raise a big question. What gets lost when these stories are so thoroughly cleaned up? What's the cost to the original storytelling and its potential impact?
It's like, are we losing something valuable in the process of making these stories more palatable?
Exactly. It's a complex issue, and there's no easy answer, but it's something worth considering.
So beyond just making them less scary, what else is driving these modern adaptations? What are publishers and creators trying to achieve when they revisit these classic tales?
Well, I think there's a desire to find a balance. They want to honor the tradition of these tales while also making them relevant and engaging for contemporary audiences.
So it's about finding a way to bridge the gap between the past and the present.
Exactly. And consumer preferences play a big role here. People are drawn to stories that resonate with their current values and expectations.
It's interesting to think how these stories, even though they're rooted in the past, continue to evolve and reflect our changing world.
They really do. They act as a kind of mirror, reflecting our hopes, our fears, and our understanding of the world around us.
And of course, these stories, especially the ones intended for children, have a significant impact on how young minds develop.
Oh, absolutely. Fairy tales play a crucial role in shaping a child's understanding of morality, good versus evil, right and wrong. They offer lessons about life, even if those lessons are often presented in a simplified way.
But not everyone is happy with these sanitized versions, right? There's a whole debate surrounding the authenticity of these modern adaptations.
There is. Traditionalists often argue that by stripping away the darker elements, we're losing something essential to these stories. They believe it's important to preserve the original intent and meaning, even if it's not always comfortable or pleasant.
So it's about honoring the cultural heritage embedded in these tales.
Precisely. They argue that these stories offer valuable insights into the past, and that we should be careful not to erase or distort that history.
That makes sense. And, earlier we talked about Little Red Riding Hood and Cinderella as examples of stories that have undergone significant transformations. Can we delve into those a bit deeper?
Sure, let's start with Little Red Riding Hood. In its original form, the story was a much more graphic warning about the dangers of disobeying your parents and trusting strangers.
Right, I remember reading somewhere that the wolf actually devours both Little Red Riding Hood and her grandmother in some versions.
That's right. And the ending wasn't always a happy one. There wasn't always a woodsman to come and save the day. It was a much darker and more disturbing tale.
Wow, that's a far cry from the version I grew up with. What about Cinderella? How has her story changed over time?
Well, Cinderella's story has been adapted and reinterpreted countless times, and each version reflects the cultural values and norms of its time.
So it's like her story has been molded to fit different societal expectations.
Exactly. In some modern versions, Cinderella is portrayed as more assertive and independent, taking control of her own destiny, while in earlier versions she was often more passive, relying on external forces to change her situation.
It's fascinating how these seemingly simple stories can hold so much meaning and how that meaning can shift and change over time.
It really is, and it's important to remember that these stories aren't just innocent entertainment. There's a whole industry built around them, a multi-billion-dollar industry.
Right. I mean, think about all the movies, TV shows, books, and merchandise that are inspired by fairy tales. It's huge.
It is, and that financial incentive plays a big role in how these stories are presented and adapted.
So on one hand, you have the publishers and studios focused on the commercial aspects, and on the other, you have scholars and traditionalists concerned about preserving the original essence of these tales. It's a complex dynamic.
It is, and I think the future of fairy tales will depend on finding a way to balance those competing forces.
So what are some of the key arguments from those who are critical of modern interpretations?
Well, they argue that by sanitizing these stories and stripping away the darker elements, we're losing valuable insights into the past. They believe that these tales, in their original form, offer important lessons about human nature and the challenges we face in life.
So it's not just about preserving the stories themselves, but also the cultural and historical context they represent.
Exactly. They're concerned about losing that connection to our past and the wisdom that these stories can offer.
This has been a really eye-opening conversation. It's made me realize how much more there is to fairy tales than meets the eye.
I agree. They're not just simple stories, they're reflections of who we are, where we've come from, and what we value.
So for you, our listener, I'd encourage you to think about the fairy tales you know and love. Maybe even seek out some of the older, less familiar versions. See how they differ from the ones you grew up with, and consider what those differences might tell us about ourselves and our changing world. As we've seen, fairy tales are constantly evolving, and their future is in our hands. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
In the whispers of wind, from the spring to the green, the red bean it grows with the love that it shows. A reminder of us in the midst of the dust. It's the hope that we hold in the stories untold. In the whispers of wind, all the hearts they begin to dance with the leaves in the love that it weaves. A melody sweet